not only does the client learn and understand what's happening during the assessment and what's expected of them, they're learning what's expected of you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our SIEGECAST here, Intro to Cloud Penetration Testing, Part 3. In Part 1, we talked about essentially a 10,000-foot view of what cloud penetration testing looks like, all the different types of cloud penetration tests and such. And then in Part 2, we talked about training resources and resources you could go to learn about how to conduct the actual penetration test itself. In this talk, we're going to be focused on all of the information that needs to be gathered by you and your clients before actually engaging during the assessment.
Yes, we'll be going over a whole bunch of items that, for the most part, should be covered before an engagement begins so that the test hopefully goes without a hitch and everything runs smoothly, and both the tester and the client will be happy with the results.
Absolutely. And the client's auditors. Yeah, they're kind of important too.
That's true.
Yeah. Okay. So diving right in, one of the things that we need to do is absolutely ensure that the client understands like what the engagement entails. If it's a cloud assumed breach engagement, what does that mean? Like, obviously we need to convey and help them understand. Sometimes, we might get return clients or seasoned clients who have already engaged in these types of assessments. But if you are put into a place in which you need to help educate the client, give them as much information as possible, and always ensure that you're on the same page as far as the penetration testers are here to help you. Anything that's going to inhibit the penetration test or the assumed breach is only going to affect the overall results and the report itself. So one of the things that we also need to communicate with our clients is the deliverables. There are deliverables from both sides, and one of the things that you may want to ask for is maybe a map of the environment. Showing what resources aren't exposed to the internet that may hold the crown jewels or the goal of the assessment. The data that may be under compliance or protected by certain cybersecurity solutions, InfoSec solutions, or what have you, that need to be tested as requirements by our clients' auditors and things like that. There's a lot actually that we could gain from this, and this should absolutely be a two-way conversation. So not only does the client learn and understand what's happening during the assessment and what's expected of them, they're learning what's expected of you. So the next time comes around where they need one of these engagements, they'll either know exactly what to ask for, or they'll immediately have it ready.
Absolutely. Yeah. I liked how you were talking about goals, Douglas, because that is actually one of the more important things to discuss when performing any type of security testing. What are the goals for the client? Sometimes we have clients come to us that have a specific scenario in mind for testing. And so that's something that is typically discussed during those pre-engagement calls.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of times the goals may be, like I said, you may have clients that have already conducted these types of assessments with third-party consultant firms and such, and this stuff may already be fleshed out. But there's ultimately going to be times when maybe even during the assessment, you may identify something that seems off or something that seems like it may be against the terms of service of the cloud service provider itself regarding the penetration test.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is too, sometimes when we test, we can actually come against past breaches, which is something that we would have to notify the client about, obviously. But I agree with you. There's a lot of things to discuss about the goals, and sensitive data coming across that is one of them, as you mentioned. But you also mentioned, and we were kind of joking before about making the auditors happy. Compliance is also an important goal of testing, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's not only as important, so it's oftentimes absolutely required. Been there, done that. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. So let's just dive right into the different types of assessments and the information that will help you and help your clients. So I'm going to kick things off with the cloud assume breach assessment. Now, one of the first conversations that we should be having is, where's the entry point? Like, where's the starting point of the assessment? And there's a couple of questions you can ask your client, such as, do you have any type of internal developers? Do you have a development team that's creating software that's either internet exposed through exposed API endpoints, or maybe exposed through a web application to internal API endpoints in the cloud environment? If that's the case, it may be a good starting point to just get access to a web server that's exposed to the internet, as though a threat under the scenario or pretext rather, that a threat actor has somehow exploited something within the stack, including the application itself, to gain access to that system, and where can they go from there? Another question I like to that we should be asking is, where is the code being hosted? So if you're creating code, and even Lambda functions, like anything anywhere where you're going to be creating source code, are you using any type of third-party code repository solutions such as GitHub, like private GitHub repositories and such? If so, it's not unheard of that developers and folks unintentionally leak access AWS access keys and secret access keys through that, just by accidentally leaving them in config files or leaving them in source code, that somehow, uh, there's many ways this can occur, somehow become changes from private to public inside of GitHub, and then poof, ultimately have a breach at that point. So that's just one example. We could drone on and on about where to actually talk about the entry points for the assumed breach assessment. But other than that, as I mentioned before, it's good to ask for, maybe the client already has threat models built, and network maps truly help in the assumed breach, especially to help the pen tester save time, because obviously threat actors have all the time in the world to figure this stuff out. And if they're flying under your radar, they can move pretty far, just because of how much time they have. And most of our assessments as cybersecurity consultants are going to be time boxed.
Yeah, that's so true, Douglas. That is always something to take thought of, because we really don't have all the time in the world like an attacker would. So it helps to have items like that, already discussed in advance. And to, like you said, we're working with the client. We're not an enemy. We're not, a threat. We're actually trying to help them. But with that said, I mean, that covers like an assumed breach. We could also say similar things for, doing pen tests for cloud, which would include both external and internal. Now with those, I would think reconnaissance, which would play a part in assumed as well, but would be an even bigger part within those as well, because you're trying to discover particular assets. And from the external side of the network, you're not going to be authenticated. So for that part, you're just going to be trying to act as an anonymous, individual trying to get in without any type of, user login or authentication. Now, within the internal side of the network, however, that's going to have you placed somewhere within that cloud environment. And we've kind of discussed that before. For both the assumed breach and internals, it's not unheard of to actually have like a box or something placed within that environment to test from. And I know you've actually had that in the past.
Yes. Yeah, I've been provided even access to Kali instances that were spun up by clients before to do internal pen tests for cloud inside their cloud environment. Yes.
But other things like you mentioned before when testing, just depending on how deep it goes, like looking into API credentials, like examining levels of system access, the different roles and things like that. All those are important within the testing environment, like what we'll be doing more again on the side of an internal. Now on the external side, again, we're coming in sort of without that. We're coming in anonymously. But what we discover from our reconnaissance, such as using tools to scrape for like potential S3 buckets and things like that, that's going to be really important to see what type of access might be available.
Yes, I can imagine the external pen test for cloud being very similar to the external pen test for basic network that's exposed to the internet, where it's very recon and OSINT heavy, very enumeration heavy. Do you find that to be the case as with cloud?
Yeah, definitely. I find, and I think I've said this before, reconnaissance is always your bread and butter. No
Yeah.
matter what test you're doing, it defines your attack surface. So it's especially going to be beneficial when you're doing something where you don't have any access into the environment, because to find something, you're going to have to dig deep and hard to hopefully find like some sort of hole that you can attack, pivot from, service, whatever. But then again, once you're on the inside, whether it be a web application or, again, assessing a network, it's still reconnaissance. What's available? Like if you're doing a typical internal test or AB, a lot of times we're looking through file shares and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's always going to be our job. Really, is relic hunters.
Yeah.
That's what we're.
Absolutely agree with that. Yeah, and as far as the OSINT part goes, you can find creds, like you can scrape breach dumps of like breach sites and breach databases and such for creds, like you said, no matter what engagement you're on. I find it interesting that the API keys, those can provide a lot of access to a cloud environment, right? But they can be found in many areas, not really just code repositories. You can find them in breach databases, and I think you mentioned to me before you've seen them before in mobile applications, like hard coded into configurations, right?
Yes, yeah. One of my favorite things to do when I'm on an application or doing a test of any kind is, especially if it's a mobile test specifically, is to go into that mobile app source code, try to decompile it, and look for hard coded strings, especially those like APIs. But I've even seen passwords in those too. I've seen things related to database connections. It's amazing what people think that they can get away with putting in that and that it won't be seen. So yeah, definitely an area to look for.
Yeah. Yeah, those types of engagements are like borderline reverse engineering.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, another way we could gain access to it, like you said, for the actual penetration test itself, is like you mentioned the jump box part, and I mentioned the Kali instance being spun up. I've had teleport access before using teleport service, in which I was provided access to I think 7 or 9 cloud environment networks for a client for an engagement once that were all accessible just right through the web browser. And the funny thing about that was they had the teleport. They were very secure. Their security maturity was pretty high, and it was so high, in fact, that I could barely use the web browser to conduct the pen tests. But yeah, just like to mention that VPN is another route that you can go. Truly, like the teleport with VPN, just the VPN itself, and like you mentioned, the jump boxes are all different ways we can, and those are things, again, we're going to have to flesh those out in these preliminary conversations that we're going to be having with our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Discussing things like access control lists and things like that to make sure that you might have to allow list an IP address so that we can actually get into the network, especially if things are blocked. So that's very important. But yeah, discussing how we're going to be able to perform the test, which method we're going to be connecting in from. Um, Obviously, a huge point, and it also enables the client to be able to monitor activity as well. Because there have been many times where I've been on an assessment and a client has legitimately been attacked by somebody else, and they'll reach out and
Mm.
say, "Hey, did you come from this IP address?" No, it was not me. So, um, yeah, so that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And a lot of the times there's going to be some sort of security solution that's going to bust. It's going to bust the folks that are moving around in the networks during our pen tests, like you just mentioned. And then there's going to be like MSPs that are put in place by, just compliance, or just the client just really embracing cybersecurity. I love that. I love when that happens, truly. I love being challenged. I like really hard engagements where, things are locked down a lot. And speaking of which, one thing we should touch upon is like the roles that we're if we're provided credentials to access the cloud service provider provided environments that our clients are paying for and securing and managing themselves, what roles do we typically ask for? As I mentioned before, the developer role is like a go-to for me because it just truly makes sense. There's so many ways that there's this, especially if there's third-party solutions that are being employed by the client for storage of any type of sensitive data, including source code. What types of roles do you tend to ask for?
Yeah, it really depends on the environment I'm testing and like the point of access. You mentioned earlier, like testing from like a web app or web server perspective. So whatever account that web server would be running under would be something that I would probably want to test from, because
Yeah.
if to compromise that web application, they would assume that role. They would have those permissions. So then that would be a really good way to represent that scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And with, proper ramp up and gaining the information from the client, including network maps, diagrams, whatever you want to ask for, it just makes our lives just so much easier to get this done within the time box of an assessment. So like you said, yeah, that's great. That's a great point. Yeah. And another thing we have to consider is like the type of compliance that our clients are under. That's a very important discussion that we need to be having before engaging in these types of assessments, because it may essentially steer the assessment. If there's PCI data and we want to test segmentation, we need to test the segmentation. Whereas we may not be testing too much segmentation if we're just going directly for PII data that's in a database somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, definitely something to discuss at the very beginning of testing, or pre-engagement. Um, and I think for the most part, we typically have clients that come to us that, when they do have some sort of compliance issue, that they usually do bring that up, and that becomes a big part of the discussion.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it feeds into the scenario of how we're attacking and information we're trying to find. But yeah, like PCI is definitely a big one, and segmentation is always key with that, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, like what you were talking about before, finding creds and network shares, S3 buckets and such, that's going to fall under some sort of data governance. Like you probably shouldn't be storing any type of sensitive information or credentials in an S3 bucket that's publicly exposed or exposed with weak access control, as you mentioned before. So, yeah, that goes a long way as what type of compliance that the client has to adhere to as far as the assessment goes.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I think that one of the other things, of course, to talk about would be, um, you know, we mentioned reconnaissance a little bit for it, but
Mhm.
do you think that all cloud assessments should include reconnaissance, or do you think it's just specific ones?
Yeah, as you mentioned with the bread and butter thing, absolutely. That should be in every engagement, because even if you're doing, like, say you're doing a regular network, a network pen test, right? And you find a domain controller, right? And there's null sessions are not enabled, and you're having a hard time getting a list of usernames within a Windows domain, right? One thing you can do is just search breach databases and see if you can map a big list of email addresses that you're finding in your breach searches uh, to the domain. Like maybe the local part of the actual email address, maybe the username in the domain. Who knows? So like that's one example. That's probably the best example I could come up with. But absolutely, especially if there's some sort of password spraying involved, or geez, if there's phishing involved, truly, obviously, if there's any type of phishing involved, obviously the OSINT part's going to let you go a long way, because doing that simple amount of research can probably get you really close to landing in the environment. It's like I'm pretty sure I think it was maybe Abraham Lincoln or somebody that was cutting down a tree, said they would spend all day sharpening their axe before actually even hitting the tree a couple of times. Like that's the same way. So you can apply that analogy to this, as OSINT would be sharpening your axe, and then you just apply the axe to the domain controllers. Yeah. Or the domain itself, whatever.
Well, on that note, what do you think about CSPs, the provided services that are being used? I
Oh,
think that's always an important discussion, right?
yeah, yeah, and we touched upon this, I think, in both of our last discussions here, in part one and part two. If our clients are using a service to create assets in their environment, like we mentioned before with some sort of Kubernetes service, and we're spinning up pods of containers or whatever, and we get access to a container, and our clients like, hey, try to escape from this container. if we don't ask the question, were you using this service or did you actually put Kubernetes inside this environment and you're managing it fully on a VM that you spun up, then versus using the service itself, you may be unintentionally breaking the terms of service of the actual penetration test in the cloud. Those questions are super duper important, especially when it comes to the time box of the assessment. If the time box window is small, you want to avoid any type of delays or hiccups. Like, you don't want to be kicked out of the environment. You don't want the client's environment to be suspended or anything by the CSP. There's so many things that can happen. And again, without these ramp up conversations before the engagement starts, we could be doing something that we're not allowed to do according to the terms of service set out by the CSP. Now, the other services besides like Kubernetes, like if there's Lambda functions or anything like that, that just helps you out a lot. One thing I always like to ask, or we should all be asking, is the crown jewels of the assessment, like say it's PII data in a database somewhere. What is the RDBMS? What is the relational database management system, right? Because we may be used to, obviously, like MySQL or MariaDB type of syntax, but we may not be experts at all of them, and you know we don't want to waste time going, oh, how do I do this SQL statement for Oracle? It's not applying to MySQL. Certain things like that just help us, you know, I guess, refresh ourselves about the all of it. Like, refresh our memories and our minds about everything that's involved with the database system itself, how to access the data, the port numbers, even. The SQL syntax, as I mentioned. So if there's any type of relational database services that are being used, I always like if it's not within the network diagrams or maps, it should be absolutely asked up front. And one last thing is like web application firewalls. If we're specifically, say we're not doing a cloud penetration test, but we're conducting a web application penetration test in a cloud, or I'm sorry, for a web application that's in a cloud. If there's a web application firewall between the cybersecurity consultant and the application itself, we may be unintentionally just testing the WAF, the entire web application firewall, the entire time, rather than the actual backend source code. So that applies also during the cloud penetration test. In terms of, I have not much more to go on, and there's a couple of days left here. I noticed that there's internal web applications, but they're being protected by, some sort of cloud uh, web application firewall solution. Could you please list my credentials or my IP address of this VM or this EC2, whatever, just so I can, try to identify as quickly as possible without jumping through as many hoops,
Yeah.
any type of vulnerability that's going to allow me to move laterally or do privest within the cloud environment.
100%. Yeah. And I think I find for the majority that the clients usually will do that when we discuss that in pre-engagement. Every now and then I'll get a client that will be like, well, we really want to see if our WAF is working. So, and then we can usually reach an agreement like the first 2 days it's on, and then the last like 3 days or whatever it's off, and something along those lines. And I'm always just like, I just really, really want to get through that part because, like you said, you're more or less just testing the WAF.
Mhm.
And, you know, WAFs can eventually be bypassed. It just
Yeah.
takes time, and the attackers will have that time to play around, to encode, to obfuscate, to do whatever they want to do to get past them. And so, we're, like you said, we're really time boxed. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, in assume breach assessments of like regular, like say an on-prem environment or an internal Windows domain network, there's a lot of heavy testing involved around security solutions, specifically like EDR, right? So if we are to apply that to cloud, there we can, there could be Windows domains inside of the cloud, and we could be essentially performing a regular network, or I'm sorry, Windows domain assume breach within a cloud environment, or we can be performing an assumed breach of the cloud itself. So that if we think about that and we apply that to what you just said, is this assessment, we need to just clarify with the client, where, Do your auditors require us to test the WAF or test the web applications or test, the data governance? Obviously the goals may not be set up actually, or defined rather, by our clients. That may be defined by the auditors who want to keep our clients under, any specific compliance to ensure that their users' data is fully protected, right?
No, absolutely. Yeah, again, important discussions because you want the most effective test. And, so it's really good to sort of drill down on the details. And again, that goes back to compliance about what is actually required. And for those that aren't under compliance, it's still about the best type of test that we can provide. And, I get it. You spend a lot of money on those solutions and you want to make sure they're working, but you're going to spend a lot of money on the test itself too. So, you really do want to get the biggest bang for your buck. But I like that you sort of brought up like those different environments. You were talking about a Windows environment, and we've been kind of talking about web. And one of the things I've found within web environments a lot lately is that some of them are being hosted in multi-tenant environments, so that's obviously one of the discussions that I think we have with cloud as well, which is, are we going to be testing, other like cross tenant type of attacks, so has that what you found as well?
That's incredibly important. Absolutely. I'm glad you brought this up. Yes. It's never a bad thing to ask your clients for more information than what's needed. Obviously, we're under an NDA, and again, we're here to help. Cybersecurity um, consultants are here to help. Like that's what we do, and we all have the same goal. And if we ask information about, other tenants, like say I get dropped into a dev environment or staging environment, like you said, Stuart, we don't test in production.
We try not to.
I mean, as developers, right? No
Yeah,
testing in production, right? Uh, that's okay, as long as the development environment matches the production environment as far as like the code goes, the solutions that are being used and everything, that should appease the auditors as far as the assessment goes, right? Now, what if there's something in the development or staging environments in our, our clients' whole clouds, everything, that maybe there's some sort of vulnerabilities or issues in which a threat actor may gain access to those environments? Can they find any type of sensitive information they can use to gain access to production? That may not be like super duper unheard of. You know what I mean? Like that's
absolutely.
probably the case, and if the client says, well, we don't want you to do, we don't need you to test any of that information, you might be able to come to an agreement where, or compromise where say, hey, okay, can I at least test my credentials there? Because if these credentials get leaked from the staging environment, I want to ensure that I'm testing whether or not they could be used in your production environment to gain the same level of access, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I've had that happen before. I've even had it that I've recalled this. I've seen this actually several times actually, where I've gotten SQL injection and I've gotten into a database and I'll start listing the different databases and I'll see prod databases. So I mean,
Yeah.
right there, and you have access to them of all things. I've seen reused credentials that work just as well in prod as they do in dev. So yeah, that's a very good point.
Bad. And honestly, if I feel like if a client's not really allowing us to test this type of stuff, it's hard for me to imagine that they're not trying to protect themselves from their auditors in some way, shape, or form, because you know we reuse passwords. We're human.
Yeah.
We reuse access control. We clone accounts, we clone roles and everything. That's why groups and roles exist, to make our lives easier, but it may make us a bit lazier, and I don't know. I give everybody the benefit of the doubt all the time. That's just who I am. And when it comes to penetration testing, I need to know as much as possible about the environment up front when it comes to cloud, because specifically rather, because I don't know. I've been just like you, Stuart. I've been exposed to so much on both sides of the fence for so many years that it's hard for me to imagine a perfect world scenario.
Yeah. No, I mean, part of being human is being error prone. So,
Yeah.
we're always going to have these issues. They will never not exist. And so, yeah, that's a good point. which actually brings up another, good point as well. We've talked about um, performing tests in these environments. It's very likely that a company has already had, tests performed in that environment. Do you typically ask for past pen tests, like reports or like potential findings from the past? What do you see when you talk with the client? I've kind of had it mixed, where sometimes the client will suggest it, or they'll mention that they've had a past pen test. I know some kind of like to want you to kind of go in blind to see what you find in comparison.
I I don't. I really should be, but I don't. Even if we just ask for a CSV, and we're like, "Hey, what did they find in the past? Would you like us to retest that?" Usually I leave that up to the clients themselves to provide that information like, "Hey, we have these pain points," right? I like using that term. From my infosec days, like there are things we really want to demonstrate. We want you to demonstrate the impact so that we can take this information to the board and just be like, hey, we need this out of here. This is bad. This is bad news. This is a hole essentially that is, uh, things baddies are getting into, but that absolutely is, like I said, you can't ask for too much information before a cloud pen test. And if you're asking for information about prior pen tests, that's only going to fuel the fire, as far as the conversation goes. People will be like, I've seen this happen on calls before, like where clients, there's like like 10 people in the call, and they're having conversations with each other, like like laughing about things like, oh, wait till he finds XYZ, oh my gosh, he's gonna have a field day with that, like that
Yeah,
happens, right?
yeah.
So that is such a good point, man, to bring that up, because that's going to anything that's going to help the preliminary conversations and spark things and get things moving. Maybe there are certain things that the client can think of that maybe the auditors might miss. Oop, I didn't mean to say that, but it's a thing, things don't, oftentimes a lot of shade thrown onto things isn't actually intentional, you know?
I like what you were talking about when you have the multiple people in the meetings. To me, and I'm sure you remember this, it was like playing Battleship as a kid, and you're like, A3 or whatever. And then like someone's like, oh, that's a hit. And it's like, so when I'm on the client calls, I'm like, oh, I noticed, you're using this framework. And or oh, I noticed you have like some legacy, applications in there, and all of a sudden their eyes get wide and they're like, uh-oh. It's like that's a hit.
Yes.
That's definitely an
Yeah.
area to be focusing on.
Yeah, and that's something, honestly, as consultants and even new firms that are starting up such like that, these are questions that we're going to learn. Like, obviously, every single client is going to have specific, not necessarily every specific, not every engagement's going to have specifics that are going to be, applied to the assessments, but every client for sure. For the years that I've been doing this, every client seems to have some sort of specific item that we should absolutely be testing or putting our eyes on or keeping in the back of our minds during the assessment. And that's what truly makes every single engagement unique. Besides the fact that we're thrown into these environments and have all of these crazy different types of software solutions that are spun up all over the place, even operating systems and stuff. Like, have you ever seen a mainframe? It's like, yeah. So, these again, like that's such a good point. Like these conversations, again, that's the point of this talk, is that there's so much that we need to ask. One thing that we should hands down be asking about is delays in testing, delays in the assessment. This is a finding, believe it or not. Like during a web application penetration test or network pen test, if you're waiting on credentials and your assessment window has started, that's a finding. Did you know that?
Yeah, we actually have that specific finding in our repository called delays in testing, and we
Yeah.
we don't like to use it. We really don't. We try
Ooh,
to avoid it, but we've
yeah.
done assessments where it's a 5-day assessment, and then day 3 we're still without access, and then you're really rushing at that point. So what you're saying is definitely true. I mean, if you're not prepared for the test, that's an issue.
Yeah.
You really need to make sure all that homework's done. And again, that's the whole point behind this pre-engagement discussion. It's the fact that, getting all your ducks in a row. to make sure that the test does run smoothly, that access has been discussed, the dates of, we're going to make sure that these credentials are to you by X date. The environment will be ready by such and such time, and that you hit the ground running.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever been on a web app pen test in which you're pen testing the web app, everything's going fine, and then all of a sudden you make a request to the like a portal or something, and everything changes, or you get a message saying we're out offline for maintenance?
Yes, yeah. One of the biggest conversations I have when I'm in the pre-engagement, discussion is, will there be any code changes? Will the code be frozen? And I always advise for frozen environments because I've actually had it happen many times where I'll be in the middle of an injection of some kind on a web assessment, and I've either nailed it and I'm like, developing the POC, whatever I'm doing, and then I'll maybe go out to lunch.
Yep.
And or like it'll be the end of, usually it's the end of the day, and you're like, okay, I'll make sure I'll finish that tomorrow. You get there and it's completely gone and it's not
Mhm.
completely fixed. So then I have to spend the next day trying to dig deeper and find out what they did to fix it, and then exploit it again differently. And I'm like, well, great, that was a couple of wasted hours. So it's better to freeze the environment, let us find the issues, so then you can see them, then you can go in and fix them, and then ask for retesting to see if it held. But yeah, that is something that is it does get me. It digs into me a bit when that happens.
Yes, and nothing against the clients, for fixing stuff during an engagement. That's fine. I've had clients that where there was just an IT guy that was just a cowboy, and he was just like, "Oh, so you exploited this? Turned it off." And then all of a sudden all the phones stop working. You know what I mean? Like, you gotta be careful, but at the same time, it's nothing there's nothing wrong with fixing issues as we're finding them. That's okay too. But if it's, getting in the way of the assessment itself, we're not like I was trying to say before with the delay in testing, that's an actual finding. Like if we don't have access like 2 or 3, we're losing 2 or 3 days during an assessment window. We're not trying to be tattletales. It's just that we have to stand behind the report. We did this report, so we have to put into the report that there was a delay, because usually the executive summary states the actual full dates of the assessment window. And also, as a finding, somebody above should see that, like a CISO or somebody should see that and think, again, we're not tattletaling or anything, we're helping. But somebody should see that and think to themselves, all right, next time we need more people on this. We need the correct people on this. We need to cut through the red tape first. We need anything to go through a change management on our back end stuff. We need to do that well before the assessment to avoid this next time, so that we get a better thorough test.
Exactly. And that includes even discussing like specific testing hours, if that's a thing, because there are companies that will say, well, we want you to test during the business hours so that there won't be sort of any off hour issue. And then we have some that are like, well, we can't have you test during business hours. We're concerned. So yeah, let's make it off hours, which, that's when we bring in the younger guys that don't need sleep. So that works.
Hey, yeah. No, no, but, applying this to cloud, if there's there could be major changes in which if you don't have a specific, defined goal, like, say you're just given a scope and they're like, "Go after this scope." You may find that some of that scope just disappears, or you may have to contact your client saying, "Hey, why is this offline? Why can't I reach this? I'm expected to test this, and now this is offline." So delays in assessment, they impact the reports, they impact the test itself, they impact the clients. The client's reputation internally. Like, it's unfortunate, but like if they can't get the clients can't get the stuff ready in time for the assessment, that's not only on the client themselves, but that could also be on us. Like, flipping all the way back to the beginning of this talk, this is a two-way conversation, and education goes both ways. So it may be something that we left out, and building a practice specifically with cloud stuff, there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of stuff involved. It may take a while to get on your feet and actually start running, but we got to crawl first, we got to walk first, before we get anywhere.
That's true. That is true. That sort of, talking about environmental issues, have you ever run into like a honeypot in your tests?
They're so annoying. Like, I get it. Like, they serve a very specific purpose, and that's awesome. But the apps in any type of penetration test, the testers should be aware of that because rabbit holes consume time, and time in a time boxed assessment is like, I don't know, it's worth its weight in gold. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of our coworkers ran up against a honeypot this past week or something like that. I know that they were pulling their hair out a little bit, but it's you're right. You don't want to waste time. Again, like time box testing, it's about time management and prioritization. So that's definitely something that if it's an environment, I would definitely say make the testers aware of, to steer clear of. Leave that for the true attackers to trigger, even if they could be funny and pull up Rick Astley videos and things like that. It's we definitely just want to get our job done.
yeah, yeah, the Rick Astley thing, that's funny. I remember that now, actually. Yeah, I've seen that in environments also, actually, and that's cool. Like I said, the honey stuff, and like you said, it's going to cause a spiral. It's going to cause the tester to go down a rabbit hole and waste time. And that if that occurs and you weren't made aware of that, it's honestly it's okay to put that into the report, that information as objectively as possible. Like, the tester came into this, honey data and was like, holy cow, and started to test the data. The data worked in some of these that turned out to be honeypots, blah, 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 down the line. And, time was wasted. Um, Obviously you're not going to say that, but, but, objectively as possible, and also contact the client directly, immediately, or, bring it up, absolutely bring it up in the debrief call at the end. Say, hey, this occurred. This honey stuff was in scope. You put this in scope, and it caused some delays in actual testing of the stuff that needed to be tested. Honeypots and honey data, all this stuff could be tested internally by pretty much hopefully anyone on the client's IT staff. It shouldn't be left up to us to test that. That's kind of odd, right?
No, I like how you keep mentioning like the reporting because I know you're really detailed in your reports and things like that. I think that's
Thank you.
obviously, a discussion also to be held for the pre-engagement. So what are your thoughts on like reporting and special requirements for reporting with the clients?
Yes, good point. This is another topic that should be brought up, obviously, before the assessment occurs. That way, we're aware of what we need to start logging. If it's special requirements, such as uh, a CSV file of findings, that's kind of easy. You could generate that afterwards. But if they want timestamps, if they want timestamps of authentication specific assessment or tests, rather, like password spraying and stuff like that, uh, you might not have that information depending on what shell you're using and stuff like that, So obviously we need that information up front. That's such a good point that you brought up, Stuart. Yes. And absolutely something not only should be asked during cloud penetration tests, but probably any penetration test, but cloud specifically. I'd say some of the extra reporting requirements, if they I don't it's hard for me to understand a scenario in which they want an external executive summary, but that's okay. You could do that after the fact. That's okay. That's easy to generate. Vuln scan reports. So I have seen this in the past. I've conducted cloud penetration tests for web application software in which a cloud configuration scan was required by the client. And holy cow, that takes an insufferable amount of time sometimes to go through, to dredge through all of that and manually verify things. And sometimes the output is just incredibly verbose. And yeah, that if the cloud configuration audits or the output of that needs to be compiled in some way, shape, or form, conducting the cloud configuration scan, sure, we just need the read access credentials from a higher, access control level standpoint, and then here's your cloud configuration scan. when it's up to cybersecurity consultants, I don't think that it just stops there. It's not a waterfall. Like we need to be like, okay, so I see all of this stuff that's wrong. So I'm gonna have to go down through all of this stuff to test this stuff, within this assessment. So you're gonna have to prioritize highs and mediums, crits obviously first. And that sucks up a lot of time. So if that's a requirement, um, that you these that type of conversation, okay, well, we're going to need to allot XYZ amount of time for just specifically for that. That's an incredible topic, Stuart. That's awesome that you brought that up. So that's one big thing. And proof of concepts, if they want a proof of concept of, say, like you mentioned before, SQL injection, yeah, that's cool. That's easy. I've had clients ask me for that on web app pen tests in the past before. If there's some sort of proof of concept that you can write up that exploits some sort of user input for Lambda functions or anything like that, um, if you find that you have to edit any type of exploit that you were given permission to run within a cloud environment for a specific old Windows server or any type of server I'm sorry, service software version or anything like that, and you have to edit it, absolutely, you should be providing that. And that is another thing that you may want to convey during the call is that, if I need to provide this to you, where are we going to provide it? So that leads us into communication. Like, how are we communicating results? How are we communicating sensitive information, credentials, the report itself, obviously. As far as cloud pen tests go, there's so much information that's sensitive. I don't think that, luckily, none of our clients argue with us saying, hey, no, we want you to put this in this open, Google Drive area or anything like that. So
No.
that's good news. But again, that's a good conversation that should be happening pretty much for any type of assessment.
Yeah. Yeah. Communication is definitely one of the big topics that we go over when we do our kickoff calls. And, common methods are typically through some form of like a Slack channel or, even Signal and other apps that are similar in that nature with, encryption. So, yeah, definitely. And then, of course, the frequency of communication. So that's another thing. Sometimes people just want to start stop notification. Others want a daily sort of summary, and then some just want, just only reach out if there's an issue type of thing. So it's always different. But I think you and I both agree sometimes it's a lot easier and better to over communicate than to not communicate at all. So
Yeah, the it doesn't really take that long. It seems like it may take that long, but I've had engagements in which the daily status update that was required at the end of the day had to contain, like, literally everything about the assessment so far, what we found today, and how it applies to what we found yesterday or before in the past, rather, anytime in the past. They wanted, just so much information, and you think to yourself, that's kind of daunting, like, what is left to be tested, what has been tested. And then there may be other channels of communication in which you need to be updating spreadsheets that they have 24/7 access to, and they're seeing it, but they're still requiring you to have these daily status updates that are extremely detailed.
yeah,
That's okay. Auditors, they'll put their foot down on people. You know what I mean? So the cover your ass aspect of cloud penetration testing is very important. But at the same time, you may think it's daunting to put all this information all over the place. It's going to take me like an hour or something. I've never found that to be the case. Honestly, it hasn't been that much of an issue. If you have to put your findings into your clients, like, findings, or I'm sorry, issues, solution software like Jira or something like that, that may take a lot of time. That may be a pain in the butt. You may want to come to terms or compromise, have them compromise, like, hey, we'll give you this report. Can you put those into your system afterwards to have them, remediated and such? That way you're not trying to figure out with what type of solution you're Googling. How do I put a screenshot into the WYSIWYG of, XYZ, right? Stuff like that is just going to delay the assessment, or cause your work-life balance to be trash. You know what I mean? At the
Yeah,
end of
no,
the day, you want to get the hell out of there. You're done. You know what I mean? So
I yeah, I mean, like, there is really a balance. I think, you don't wanna get to the point where, from the client side that you're drowning the pen tester and keeping them from working, but obviously communication is key, and, so, um, again, a lot of things, there's always sort of a middle ground, and that's what we try to reach, be effective and not restrictive.
yeah, some of that stuff I just mentioned, that's like borderline being onboarded. Like you become
Oh,
an employee there.
and
It's
we've had to do that before. Like some of
yeah.
the tests will actually require onboarding. And I think I mentioned to you, I even tested one once where I had to be on video. I had to be watched the whole time while I was testing because they had certain areas of a web application that they would not allow tested, and they wanted to make sure I didn't go there. So they would watch, like I had to
Oh,
share
sure.
my screen and like I had to be careful. I guess they were afraid I was going to photograph the screen or something like that. So like I wasn't allowed to go on certain bathroom breaks unless I got permission. That was just really nerve wracking.
What?
Terrible. I hate, like you said, work life balance at that point was like complete trash. I was
Yeah,
afraid to
so
think.
maybe some of these conversations may bring to light, like, hey, from our team, our full team's perspective, maybe we need to make this assessment window a little bigger. You know, maybe we
Exactly.
need to requote the client for this assessment. So again, these talks are super duper important. They are excruciatingly important as far as the assessment goes, to save time and make sure the test is at 100% as thorough as humanly possible. Again, we're all human, so
Most of us.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, thank you, Stuart, for bringing up all these great topics and such. I feel like this is a great amount of information to take back. If you're taking notes in your Obsidian, whatever you're taking your notes in, go back to these notes now and start building out your requirements for the preliminary requirements and conversations and such that you should be having with your clients.
Absolutely. And it's always a pleasure, Douglas. Always love discussing these things with you.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. And with that, please look forward to the cloud penetration testing intro to cloud penetration testing SIEGECAST part 4.